Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is Vayera. Last year, we explored liberation theology and its relationship with the biblical Exodus. Today, we explore Martin Luthur King Jr.'s iconic I Have a Dream speech, along with an interview he gave at the convention of the Rabbinical Assembly for Conservative Judaism a year after the Six-Day War and 10 days before he was assassinated. We will showcase King's identification with a prophetic tradition which saw the universality of the Exodus story without diminishing its unique message for the children of Israel. So join us for MLK and Exodus. So, Rabbi, I looked back last year and I did a solo podcast on liberation theology. I was in the holy city of Jerusalem, and my guess is you were traveling to Dubai because you just told me.
I probably was, right.
Yes. So we discussed how Christians, especially in South America, took the story of the Exodus and used it and created something called liberation theology. And we ended up talking about how some Jews, we discussed John Levinson from Harvard and Yeshayahu Leibovich, how they had a very minimal understanding of what the Exodus meant to us. And we'll get back to them during the course of tonight's event. But because we are on the eve of Martin Luther King weekend, I thought it would be a wonderful experience to look at some of his writings, specifically the I Have a Dream speech, and an interview I had no idea existed, as I said in the intro, that was made 10 days before he was assassinated, and just as meaningfully after the Six-Day War. So we're in for a little bit of a treat tonight, I hope. And I just want to say that we just finished, today was Rosh Chodesh Shavat. And I was having a discussion with my grandson, Ari, about 2 years ago. He goes to a beautiful progressive school called the Abraham Joshua Heschel School. And I said, what do you learn in school? And he goes, well, we learn about the holidays and stuff. I said, well, what holiday is it this month? What Jewish holiday is it? And he says, oh, it's Martin Luther King weekend. It's Martin Luther King Day. So I think, at least from his perspective, Martin Luther King is a Jewish holiday. And I think if we're successful, if I'm successful with the texts, I think that concept will resonate with us just a little bit. I don't know if you celebrate Martin Luther King, if he resonates with you.
We sure do. It resonates with me, and I don't give class that day. Very much resonates. It's a good topic for today.
In the source sheet, one of the sources I quote is from thetorah.com, and in the intro, the scholar says he listens to that speech every year. So we shall see that it really does resonate because it's a midrash, it's a commentary. So we are in Vayera, Exodus 7:26, and basically it says, Hashem said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus said God, let my people go, that they may worship me. Shalach et ami v'yavduni. Now, this is not the only time in the Chumash that we have these iconic words, let my people go. And in Exodus 5:1, it says, thus said God, let my people go, that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness. So last year I made the case that there is a midrash that says that every holiday in Judaism is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. I mean, basically, you cannot do pretty much anything in Judaism that you don't make a blessing that somehow ties it in to Yetziat Mitzrayim. I think it's safe to say that leaving Egypt or throwing off the Pharaoh is a seminal, an absolutely seminal nation-forming moment in our Jewish tradition. Would you agree with me?
I would absolutely agree with that.
So the question that I asked last year and the question I'm asking today is, how does that seminal moment and iconic paradigm translate to the world? And last year we talked about a lot of Christian scholars who basically took it. And when they were up against a tyrant, a dictator, he became the Pharaoh and they became the children of Israel. If they had a Che Guevara, if they had a Castro, and then ultimately when they decided to overthrow the Castro and they had a new leader, they were always the Moses. But not so much when it comes to the Jewish people. I think in talking about Martin Luther King, we'll see that he walked a very fine line where he never took it away from the Jewish people. And I think that impacts upon what his interpretation was of the uniqueness of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So I think, you would be remiss, and if you were asking what is the meaning of Yetziat Mitzrayim to the Jews, if you didn't quote the numerous passages in the Torah, such as the one in Deuteronomy 24:17, that say, "You shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or the fatherless. You shall not take a widow's garment in pawn. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that your God redeemed you from there. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment." So the concept is less about any coming to the land of Israel, getting the Torah. It has to be that you understand at a visceral level what it means to be exploited, what it means when people are not treated in an equitable, fair way, and therefore you have to treat people in an equitable and fair way. And I think that's our key understanding of the concept. Last year, we ended up by saying that Levinson said, "V'avduni" is the key word. Let my people go to serve you. You don't serve Pharaoh, you serve God. And the way you serve God is by keeping his law. Not only his festivals, but his laws of weights, his laws of paying the worker on time. We are a people of law, and if there is anything about the law that is impactful, is that it has to be applied to everybody in an equal way. So I think you will never say to me, "Rabbi, you agree totally." This is a thread. This is certainly a gisha, a way of looking at this, but I think it's a fairly mainstream one.
Very much mainstream. And, you quoted the Midrash that every Jewish holiday is in commemoration of the Exodus. And you can go further than that. Obviously, the major Jewish holiday, the entire ceremony of that holiday is the Seder, to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Right? It's literally the biggest ceremony of the year is Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to start by just quoting an African-American spiritual. And it's the theme is, "Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Or when Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. So the Lord said, go down, Moses, way, way down in Egypt land. Tell all pharaohs to let my people go. So Moses went to Egypt land, let my people go. Let my people go. The takeaway that I took, and there are many versions of this song, is when it says, tell all pharaohs. It was clear to the writers of this song and the singers of this song that Pharaoh was not a point in time, and the Exodus was not a moment in time. That it transcends time, and it affects anybody who is feeling that they are pushed down, that they are oppressed. Oppression is the key word here, and that there is someone who will stand up, truth to power, so to speak, to take them out. And that is, I think, the core that the African Americans took, and therefore this song and this concept resonated so strongly with them.
Right. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the fact that "Let My People Go" is in its sense musical, right? I mean, that it's a lot in the translation. "Shalach ami v'yavduni," that's powerful. But "Let My People Go" is really, really lends itself to a black spiritual.
Yes. So what I was amazed by is that if you do a Google search for "I Have a Dream" speech and the Bible, there are so many scholars, historians, scholars in literature, and as importantly, scholars in scripture who have studied this speech and how these spirituals and the concept, the paradigm of the Israelites, Moses, Pharaoh in Egypt has resonated. And one of them that I came across was called Second Isaiah Lands in Jerusalem, D.C. by Keith Miller. And what he explains is that, and it really hit me when he says, a white chaplain in the Union Army regretfully noted there is no part of the Bible with which slaves are so familiar as the story of the deliverance of Israel. Moses is their ideal of all that is high and noble and perfect in man. That the American abolitionists frequently paralleled American slaves to Hebrews in Egypt, and even former slaves intent on moving to Kansas christened themselves Exodusters. So this was like so powerful an image to so many people. And in the "I Have a Dream" speech, they go verse by verse or stanza by stanza and say, what does Martin Luther King do in terms of drawing from the Old Testament? So at one point he says, we cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And that is a direct quote from Amos 5 that talks about the Jewish people at the time. And in the words of God, it says, I loathe, I spurn your festivals. I am not appeased by your solemn assemblies. If you offer me burnt offerings or grain offerings, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gifts or fatlings, your sacrifices. Spare me the sounds of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes. But let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. It seems, and I think this will come through clearer, for Martin Luther King's understanding of the Exodus, it was all about dealing with people equitably, evenly. And this idea of justice like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream, this concept of going down to Egypt, this idea of leveling the playing field, of going down to the weakest member and making sure that they have the same access and same opportunities, that is the core of what I think Luther, and we'll see as he takes away these speeches, what he was looking for. And a lot of it has to do with economic justice.
So I just want to say, I mean, of course, you're right. That's not the Torah's view of the Exodus. That's more the prophet's view of equality. If you look at Amos, if you look at Isaiah, you have a lot more of economic equality. The Torah doesn't portray the Exodus from Egypt as being about economic equality. It's about freedom from slavery. It's like you quoted Leibowitz, that it's about via avduni, that we should serve God and not serve Pharaoh. But right, there's nothing about economics, really. It's not that slavery isn't fair economically.
Well, except you can make the argument that when the verse that I quoted at the beginning from Deuteronomy, when it talks about you shall not mistreat the fatherless, the stranger, the widow's garment in pawn, these are people that are economically dependent and at risk. So there is a little bit of it. I think that clearly the prophetic tradition took that and maximized it and elevated it. But I think there is something there. All of those quotes that say, don't do this because you were a slave in Egypt, have to do with dealing with someone. And you can argue whether it's economically less off or from a power point of view or less off. So maybe if I had to translate what you're saying, it's not only economics. I think it also has to do with people who just don't have the resources, the power structure that are...
Right. I think it's about a power structure. It's about an inequality in a power structure. Now, you're right. Economics is a piece of that.
So the other big phrase that he says is, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see again. Now, was Isaiah 40. Let every valley be raised, every hill and mount made low. Let the rugged ground become level. Let the ridges become plain. The presence of God shall appear in all flesh, as one shall behold, for God is God, has spoken. So he is quoting Isaiah. And the amazing thing about this verse in Isaiah is that we've quoted it before. We quoted even the story of Agnon, Ha'akov Lemishur, making the crooked straight. But clearly, this verse, similarly to the one from Amos about the water going down and finding its level, it seems to me that it's very much about leveling the playing field, to use an economic term. And that's what comes off very clear. The other verse that I quoted from Amos, which actually blew me away, which God talks about, to me, O Israelites, you are just like the Cushites. So the Israelites are just like the blacks, declares God. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Kir. So getting back to your point, Rabbi, yes, the prophets really did go a long way in universalizing the message.
See, to me, that's a really important point, because your point of the way Martin Luther King uses this story, the truth of the matter is that 3,000 years ago, that's what the prophets did.
And he would not argue with you. He was not trying to be an innovator.
He was trying to be a prophet.
Yes. I think in a sense, when his other speech, when he talks about being to the mountaintop and I might not make it, he clearly saw himself as a Moses figure, but I don't think it was out of any sense of pride or feeling that he was I think it was out of responsibility and out of the sense that he was put into this place from history and he had kind of no choice. but definitely he was seen that way, and definitely he plays that role. And getting back to the verse from Amos that I quoted before, that he says the Israelites are like the Cushites and like the Philistines and the Arameans, in meaning to say every nation has its Pharaoh. Every nation has its Exodus and has to find its Moses. He ends by saying, this will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom sing. And then this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So that was how he ended the speech, and he really is talking about equality of everybody should be treated the same, and again, we can't but help but think of what the rhetoric is today. When a person of a certain color skin, let's say is white, is automatically targeted as whether it's a colonialist or privileged or an exploiter, and everyone who has slightly more pigmentation is already put in a different field. What he was saying rings so much more powerfully in my mind, that the idea is that we should not look at the color of one's skin, but of the character inside. And I think that is a message that he could easily take from the prophets, which I interpret in terms of everything he's been saying as this kind of equalizing wave. And I think it's a message that rings true, especially today.
There's no question that, well, let's take a few things. It rings true, especially today. And, that's something about the eternity of these messages, because it comes from the Torah and it's elaborated upon by the prophets. And then Martin Luther King makes it famous 60 years ago, and it's just as true in 2024. So, I think that's about the fact that the messages of the Torah, the power of the Torah, isn't in the moment, but it's for all times.
I agree. The only thing that I will say, and now I'm going to get a little bit into this interview that I discussed earlier, that he gave at the 68th Annual Convention of the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism. The way I understand him now after reading these texts is that clearly economic equity, economic justice, and equality before the law were what he was aiming for. Not revenge, not flipping the switch, not flipping the table. He understood that we can all be Egyptians, we can all be pharaohs, we can all be children of Israel, we can all be Moseses, and what we need to find is the path of justice. And I think he was asked at this convention about Israel and the Arabs. And it, as I said in the intro, it was after the 67 war, and everybody, when they talk after the 67 war, says that Israel was now no longer David, it became the Goliath. And I think that's a not such a great model. I think the model that he was looking for is more of this Exodus model, and one of making equality. So he says as follows in answer to the question of where he stands on the Middle East. I think it is necessary to say that what is basic and what is needed in the Middle East is peace. Peace for Israel is one thing. Peace for the Arab side of that world is another thing. Peace for Israel means security, and we must stand with all of our might to protect its right to exist, its territorial integrity. I see Israel, and never mind saying it, as one of the greatest outposts of democracy in the world, and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land almost can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. On the other hand, we must see what peace for the Arabs means in a real sense of security on another level. Peace for the Arabs means the kind of economic security that they so desperately need. These nations, as you know, are part of that third world of hunger, of disease, of illiteracy. I think that as long as these conditions exist, there will be tensions. There will be the endless quest to find scapegoats. So there is a need for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, where we lift those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder and bring them into the mainstream of economic security. I just thought that, number one, it rang so true, but the reason it rings so true is he doesn't talk about states. He doesn't talk about sovereignty. He doesn't talk about he talks about economic security. For the Arabs. And to me, it was just, it wasn't a kind of a detour from his message. It was the message that he had been preaching in all of the writings that we've discussed tonight and so many others, that the law has to be equal and there has to be economic security. And if there isn't, then you get into desperation and violence. I was just kind of blown away from that. And I do quote I have a source for the whole interview. It was a public interview 10 days before he was killed. And it's in the Sephira notes. The only thing that I'll also add that also rang so true was one of the questions was that there were already in those days radical Black Panthers and others who were calling him a whitey, is how it's referred to in the interview. You can call it an Uncle Tom, that he was kind of being part of the white world. And he gets a chance to talk about color. He says, on the Middle East crisis, we have various responses. The response of some of the so-called militants, again, does not represent the position of the vast majority of Negroes. There are some who are color consumed, and they see a kind of mystique in being colored, and anything non-colored is condemned. We do not follow that course in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He goes on to say, talking about anti-Semitism. It is not only that anti-Semitism is immoral, though that alone is enough. It is used to divide Negro and Jew, who have effectively collaborated in the struggle for justice. It injures Negroes because it upholds the doctrine of racism, which they have the greatest stake in destroying. There isn't anyone in this country more likely to understand our struggle than Jews. Whatever progress we've made so far as a people, their support has been essential, probably more than any other ethnic group. The Jewish community has been sympathetic and has stood as an ally to the Negro in this struggle. It was just very, very refreshing, Rabbi.
I mean, that's so interesting, of course, because just then, 1968, is when, the Black Power, like you mentioned, the Black Power movement was just gaining force. It really gained force only after the assassination of Martin Luther King, but they all of a sudden didn't see the Jews as partners anymore. There was a famous case in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, in the school district, in which the blacks took over the school district and they try to push out the Jewish teachers because they didn't see the Jews as being their allies anymore. So he's talking about a really what we would call a much healthier vision of Jews and blacks being partners. And that's an amazing image that he has of Israel after 67, when things were so bad for the Arabs after 67, but he turns that biblical vision into a vision for contemporary Israel. That's amazingly powerful.
And in the full interview, he literally has a whole page on Black Power, and he says it's a terrible bumper sticker. And he even goes so far as to say that any phrase that you have that takes 5 minutes to explain what we mean is like a joke that you have to explain. It's not very effective. It's a fascinating interview. And to me, it's a fascinating reboot, but it also, as we're in Shemot, as we're discussing the Exodus and approaching Martin Luther King Day, it gives us all, I think, pause to look back at the Exodus story and the traditions that we share in the world shares at explaining, understanding, be inspired by the Exodus story. And I think it is a better paradigm and model than maybe a David and a Goliath. There were some of the, as you research the sources, it talks about why Moses was picked and not a David, why not a king, but actually a popular ruler. It talks about the whole dynamics between the South and the North. He's asked about anti-Semitism in the interview, and he says, we don't have anti-Semitism down South. He says, and he explains what happened when Negroes went to the North, and they went into tenements that might have been vacated by Jews, and the Jews became their landlords, and the pricing was different. And then he talks about, when there's one bad apple, you can't blame a whole race, because that's called, wait for it, racism. So it's just, I think, it's like when you look back at your biblical sources, I think looking back at a speech like this, looking back at a man like this, and his message is very refreshing. And if you can call it a reboot, you can call it a chazara. The point is, I think it's important from time to time to do that. And I felt blessed last night when I was thinking about what to talk about. I will say that there is another book that I quote in my sources, and it's from a friend of mine, Dumasani Washington. You might remember, Rabbi, we had him on one year to discuss Parshat Noach. He has an absolutely amazing book called Zionism and the Black Church, and it is a source book and an inspiration so that none of you think that this close working relationship between Jews and the African Americans has ended, that it's a thing of the past. Read his book and go to his website. It is happening even today. And so there is a light at the end of that tunnel as well. And we just have to keep talking about our sources and looking for inspiration for our great leaders in a generation that is so lacking in them.
And I think the answer is, in these days, which there's so much darkness, to look at the sources and to know that there's light is really a very important lesson for all of us. So thank you so much, Geoffrey. Next week from the UAE, I look forward to sharing Parshat Bo. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and thank you so much.
Shabbat Shalom. And I must say that since I was kind of inspired by the Torah.com, where he said every year he listens to this speech, so here it is. Shabbat Shalom.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must fail to conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.